YouTube. I'm excited to be in another Sabbath and have another opportunity to communicate some wisdom, some understanding to you guys. We are definitely in a new season. The new season is basically kind of, from what I can tell, it's basically a deeper examination of these parent roots from the perspective of an anthropological or archaeological connection. The best way I could put it to you is that we have discovered that these ancients had some sort of belief about their pictographs and their culture. For example, the word light is the drawing of a human head and the drawing of an ox's head. And that also is the word for sight, which has something to do with light. They couldn't have known that. There's no way they could have known about rods and cones unless there was some sort of wisdom, depth of wisdom beyond what we already know. Why is this important? Well, first of all, I think there is a necessity to understand that Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. Okay, so in principle, with that thought process, we have got to kind of look at the idea that maybe they did know these things. However, there is an unfortunate human bias attached to words like glory, holy, right? Splendor. Any of the other English words that seem to indicate light emission, right? Light brightness, shininess, right? But that's not what we have in these pictographic drawings, right? We don't, in these ancient drawings on this powdery shards in the Sinai Peninsula and in the Fertile Crescent in the Levant, we have all these different areas where they're digging up these pottery shards and seeing this ancient language, and some of it doesn't make sense on what the modern Hebrew, even if you were to get a Chumash, right, and look at these words, they don't mean what it says in the English versus what it says in the Hebrew versus what it says in the ancient pictographic letters. Well, this week is definitely, this message is definitely one that I think is going to draw a lot of attention to that truth. We'll see how much so, but generally speaking, that's what we're going to work with. A couple things that we need to do, though. The first thing that we need to do is we need to understand that the adversary, whoever he may be, or whoever it may be, or whatever it may be, whether it be a force of destruction or whether it be a actual personality, Scripture's a little bit obscure on that. And we have a bunch of Catholic constructs. In other words, somebody had a good imagination and constructed what the adversary would be like, okay, with his pitchfork and his pointed tail, right? So, you know, he's running around in red pajamas with the pointing horns and all that. That's all construct. There is no definable physical appearance description of said devil in Scripture. However, after his heart ministries, in the process of course, walking out the model, right? We find a path, we see whether or not it bears fruit. If it doesn't bear fruit, we throw it out, replace it. We see if that bears fruit. If it does, we practice it. If the practice goes well, then we will teach it to others. That is the after his heart ministries model. Well, we've had to do that with the devil, right? We've had to do that with a number of things. But one of the things we've discovered is whatever this force is, whatever this adversarial element is, it tries to remove three things from the believer's process. Number one, it tries to remove authority, which is technically jurisdictional, and it is also delegated. What does that mean? Yahweh put Adam in charge of the earth and the sons of Adam in charge of the earth. It seems as though he put the sons of God in charge of heaven, but that's another story, right? The rulership of heaven, or Malchut Hashamayim, or what it actually is translated in the English, the kingdom of heaven, seems to have been granted to the sons of God. Now, having said that, we say, well, what's the difference between the son of Adam and son of God? That's not relevant to this discussion. Because the second thing that we need to identify that seems to be an attempt to remove from the believer's life is power, energy, actual supernatural, sourced from God power. And this is where we get into walking on water. This is where we get into healing. This is where we get into awkward things like Paul wiping the sweat off his brow and handing the person the handkerchief and then taking the handkerchief and putting it on the person getting better. Okay. Awkward stuff like that. Okay. And then finally, we have the corporate collective consciousness. Corporate collective consciousness seems to be some semblance of a spiritual thread that's connected from believer to believer to believer to believer, who are all on the same page doctrinally. Yes, of course, that's a given, right? Because somewhere along the lines, we're going to start to get into what you did not learn in the pew and why you didn't learn it. And now that you are being prepared for greatness, you are not sitting in the pew anymore. The Father has brought you out of the pew. But this corporate collective consciousness seems to have some sort of supernatural energy connection. There seems to be a relative element of authority in the sense of a primary individual who leads that whole entire group of minds. But in general, that's the concept of being in one accord that we come up with in Acts chapter 1 and chapter 2. Okay, so those three things seem to be what the enemy is trying to unseat. Well, why is that, right? What are the things that are going on with those three elements? Well, with a strong mind, remember we learned that from this idea of the head of the ox and the head of a man drawn together to indicate what light is. Yeshua says, you're the light of the world. Don't put it under a bushel, right? You put a candle in a window. You don't put it under a bushel. So he's saying, you're the light of the world. You need to be it, right? But then, of course, then he turns around and says, Malchut HaShamayim, the kingdom of heaven is in you, right? So we have a lot to get through here. A lot of navigation that is the opposite almost of what we have learned in the pulpit. Okay, so moving forward into this, one of the more relevant elements is going to be an understanding that if those things were somehow, there's a design to try to unseat those things, then those things must be important to Malchut HaShamayim, the kingdom of heaven. In that process, of course, we have to identify why they're important. Well, what's interesting about this is what we have learned, of course, from Noach, right? What we've learned from Lech Lecha, what we've learned from Bereshit, what we've learned from Chayei Sarah is that there is a necessity to have some self-mastery. That self-mastery is definitely the form of a strong mind. And remember that you have two things that completely prevent you from being successful in whatever it is you endeavor to do. One is limiting beliefs, and the second is a lack of imagination. Now, what's interesting about that is that as you move forward, you need to remember that's one of the four human endowments, imagination, right? The idea that you could name an animal. God brings the intensification of all power in the universe, brings animals to Adam to have him name them. And whatever he comes up with, imagination and will, that's what it was called, right? That's the surface level. Of course, we know that actually what was going on in that creation process was that whatever he called them, that's what they became. That's what they materialized into. So in that process of trying to identify why these things are important, obviously we can get bogged down in the details. In the course of everything, a strong mind is going to operate in the process of authority over all elements of nature, of creation, of the cosmos, etc. Now, obviously, it would take an extraordinary person to move in the direction of that depth, right? To be able to have command over the sun, moon, and stars, like who did? Who had command over the sun, moon, and stars? Joshua. Sun, stand still, right? Okay. So in principle, as we're working through this, I think it is very important that as we're moving forward and as we're connecting with these things, that we have a grasp on the reality that when David says, when I look into the night sky and I see the stars and I see the sun and the moon, I ask, what is man that you are mindful of him? And he says, but you have made man a little lower than Elohim. You have made Adam a little lower than Elohim. Well, there's something important there. There seems to be a point in time where that evolution moves to Elohim in Psalm 82, which means there's a lower and a higher self. This higher self happens to also be a future self. What does that mean? That means that as you continue to endeavor, that higher self is not achieved yet and is a potential within you and therefore an energy within you that can now currently affect the things around you. Well, what's interesting about this current parasha is that it has to do with the past, the present, and the future. I will explain. You need to remember that Torah is a transcript of a mouth-to-mouth discussion between Moses and the intensification of all power in the universe, Yahweh, the perceivable part of God, okay? And I endeavor to use that word only for those who lack understanding of what Elohim really means, okay? But in principle, we'll just go with God because that's what everybody understands this thing, this intensification of all power in the universe, the star breather, to be. But the level of operation in the cosmos is really, truly not necessarily understood. So we have a cosmic process, right? We have a microcosmic and we have a macrocosmic process. What is that? Well, microcosmic is basically the you, right? The I, right? The sentient being that has the four human endowments: sentient, consciousness, will, power, and imagination. And recall that there is a concept or a process in that there is a macrocosmic human being. What does that mean? That means that there's a mankind representation. I want you to recall that in general, when we look and we try to identify the flow of things, there is an evil spirit, an evil ruach, or an evil path, and there is a holy spirit, or a ruach hakodesh, a set apart spirit, yes, amen, but also what? An intensifying of energy spirit. Remember, when you look into the ancient Hebrew concerning the word holy, we don't encounter law, right? We don't encounter this piety. We encounter an intensifying of energy and a polarization of that energy. Keep in mind that in general, these forces are what? They are not benevolent nor malevolent. Why is that important? Because the source itself is not good nor evil, but instead good nor evil have their place in the world of formation. What does that mean? That means that in this place, height, width, depth, time, for human endowments, we polarize the energy. There's a reason why this is important. Basically, as information comes in, we, through our biases, our manipulations, our desire to be in control, and our general disregard for the Torah, the teaching and instruction of God, we have deviated off onto these other paths. Well, what's intriguing is the majority is who controls the path. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is a flow of energy occurring in the universe, but it is the will of man who directs it, the sons of Adam who direct that flow of energy. That flow of energy can either be to the side of obedience to Yahweh or disobedience to Yahweh. Case in point, the Tower of Babel. Let's disregard the fact that they made a waterproof snorkel and city just in case there was another flood. In other words, we are not afraid of you. Bring your flood again. We will survive it. He says, okay. That's what you'll do. Okay. And he says what? He says, they are all one, echad, right? Remember our study on the word, on the letter chet last week, and the word dalet, meaning the word unity, but in a very deep sense of the word. Because what you need to remember is all these anthropomorphic symbols, hands, eyes, tents, rivers, don't exist in the upper realms. They exist as forces. Remember, Yeshua said, God is spirit. And we would worship him in spirit and truth. Well, nobody knows what the word spirit means. They don't even they don't even remotely understand the level of depth that word means, because they're content with that it is just simply a person of the Trinity. Or perhaps maybe a mode of God. You don't understand that in the upper worlds, there is no skin and bone. There is no brain. There is no function of humanity up there. And when I say up there, I don't mean physically up in this height, width, depth, time. I mean in ascension of degree, of intensity, of energy, but also knowledge. Probably intimacy with the intensification of all power in the universe as well. We know that the principle of energies being moved has to do with polarity. We've got that. We get that. But what's amazing is as we get into this idea of this corporate collective consciousness, we have these people who are all one at the Tower of Babel. And at the Tower of Babel, we have an engaging with God through their actions of saying, we will make a name for ourselves. Well, if you really understood the ancient pictographic Hebrew of that, you would see that it has something to do with chaos and potentially what we might call magic. Whatever the process is, he testifies. Remember, this is the intensification of all power in the universe, the one who breathes stars out of his mouth, one who makes stuff like this behind me, and a thought. And yet, he comes down, not physically, not from the sky, but from a dissension in degree of intensity, and a dissension of degree of energy, and a dissension of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. looks at the city, looks at the people, says they're all one. This is what they endeavor to do. Now, nothing shall be impossible for them. I want you to think about that. The intensification of all power in the universe testifies about those humans at that time that there is nothing that would stop them. Nothing. Think about that. The God who breathes stars out of his mouth says these group of people who are together need to be stopped because nothing will be impossible for them. That is not a concept you understand. I want you to think about things that are impossible. Right? Think about the level of limitations you have. Can you fly? According to the intensification of all power in the universe, they could if they wanted to. The absolute exploitation of sentience, consciousness, willpower, and imagination was present in that group of people. That was a corporate collective conscience. That corporate collective conscience is something that sways this energy to be what? Malevolent. And therefore, the kingdom at that time, or maybe I should say the civilization of that time, which would probably either predate or contemporary with the Sumerian Empire, was absolutely a threat to the kingdom of heaven. The few times when God has had to intervene and had to interfere with something, this is one of them, when he confounds the language. Do we call BS? Do we say, oh, no, this is just a story. It's mythological. We can't necessarily trust it. The idea that something would not be impossible for a human, it's just not scientifically possible. Well, there's the interesting thing. There were 70 nations present, 70 generations present at the Tower of Babel. 70 different groups of people groupings. We have the CIA going and tracing 70 original languages. No matter how you spin it, no matter how you manipulate it, you can explain it away. You could say that it's mythological. You could probably explain away what I just said. But the point is that if you are a believer, you need to understand that there is a malevolent majority who is able to sway the energy in the universe. A malevolent majority who do not want to be obedient to God, who believe that the liberty of life does not contain the teaching and instruction of God. The Hebrew word for that is Torah. The English translation of that is the law. Now, scientists have discovered that we have something, and I may mispronounce this, but it is epigenetics, which is the principle that there are generational imprintings of both, generational imprintings of the emotional attachment to learnings. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have both good and bad memories that predate your birth. And that those memories or that encoding has already begun to make an adjustment on your current process. Yahweh says he visits the sin upon the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Okay, we're going to talk about generations in a minute, but this is what I want you to think about. Then he says, I have mercy on thousands who love me. So I am a jealous God. I visit the sins of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Now let's talk a minute about the word hate. The word hate in the Hebrew is the drawing of a thorn and of a seed. Meaning what? That seed which grasps, right? That seed which takes hold. That's the word hate. The word hate is the seed which catches the leg, right? So when you're walking down the path, you're trying to walk a path, and there's this moment where you hit this thorn bush or whatever, and it begins to scratch your leg and catch hold of your clothes. and pulls and grabs and takes hold. Enter epigenetics. Now, there are people, for example, there are those who have taken liberty with this science to say that that is proof that there needs to be apologies to generations because the trauma is present in them. And then you got these crazy, off-the-wall, twisted mind people who believe that they're entitled to something because of damage that was done 40 generations ago. I submit to you that Ezekiel chapter 18 says the children eat the father eats the grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, the sourness of the grapes carries to the next generation. And Ezekiel says, no, each man will die in his own sin. Each man will die in his own sin. So what do we have here? What we have is the responsibility of every human being to change that generational junk and not feel entitled to anything. Remember, the three destructive elements is what? The trauma that you don't let go of, right? The limiting beliefs of something that has basically told you that you can't do. And what's the last one? It is the process of when you have these generational things going on that are actually creating an information in you that's preventing you, right? It's what? Entitlement. Entitlement is the single most destructive element in a human. I have a right to this because this happened to me. No, you don't. Justice is the equal distributor of reward and consequence. And justice is not some human trying to make a decision sitting in a black robe. Justice is a force in another realm that manifests itself here through people. Okay? Equal distribution of reward and consequence. That's judgment. Okay. So when we're working with this idea of generations, there's a few things you need to realize. There are generations before you, there are going to be generations after you, and the decisions you make and the things that you experience and the things that you do not heal from, your limiting beliefs and your entitlement, all are imprinted on the DNA as you pass it to the next generation. Why is this so important? Because we are trying to become the change that this world needs. And I will remind you that the reason why this world does not change, the reason why we don't have a spiritual evolution, the reason why we don't see the book of Acts anymore is because we have become a logical being without any mythological process. We have stopped believing in the power and energy. And those who practice it are called New Agers, witches, etc. Now, this is what I want you to think about. And I will remind you that for 10 years, I was a Satanist. I practiced spells, black magic. I conjured demons. I wrote curses. I enacted things in other realms that would affect this realm for malevolent purposes. I was practicing witchcraft. Why? Because my heart was rebellious against the intensification of all power in the universe. I was angry with him about the damage that was done to me as a child. And Satanism indulges in that anger. Why is it important? Because it worked. The curses worked. The black magic worked. Why? Because the energy present and the emotions present and all of the other stuff that goes into those processes is a science, not mythology. It's just a science that this world refuses to accept. So if the kingdom of darkness is able to operate in this way, Malchut ha-Choshech, right? Malchut ha-Choshech, the kingdom of darkness. That right there, that part means that we are failing as believers. Now, does that mean that we need to run out and start practicing magic and start doing all kinds of weird things? No, not necessarily. That's not what I'm saying. When I say not necessarily, because we don't know what actually was going on in the book of Acts. We think we know because we have a nice guy that did us a favor and gave us an English version of the Bible, good old King James, who would have never benefited from the truth that's in the Bible because it would have told him to help people become wealthy. Torah says you be the head and not the tail. How can a peasant ever be the head and not the tail? There's no reason for King James to have translated the Bible correctly. But bless his heart, we got it, right? We got the version of the Bible that we think is just straight up truth. In that process, we have lost so much, even from the Latin to the English, even from the Greek to the Latin, even from the Aramaic to the Greek, and even from the Hebrew to the Aramaic. That's right. Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, English. And dear God, easy English. When we begin to get our minds wrapped around the idea that there is an ancient wisdom present, when somebody thinks to themselves something about the sun and then draws a ox's head and a human head and says, a strong mind is light. What they were trying to tell us is that something flows, something moves. Here's the crazy part about this. If you get your mind wrapped around this epigenetics enough, you will start to get your mind wrapped around the concept that generations past made decisions about your generation as a majority that have caused the cosmic flow or this river or this path or this spirit to move in a certain direction and swayed it before you were ever born. And then their DNA told you to continue in it. How many generations? How many generations from your people have you or do you know of who bought into the Catholic construct of hell? Who bought into the idea that a self-respecting Jew who claims he did not have anything unclean touch his mouth from birth, meaning he was a Torah observant Jew, a Shomer Torah, a guardian of Torah, even after Yeshua had died and rose again, that man who, when Torah says don't have the name of gods on your lips, has the nerve to mention Tartarus and Hades in his letters. What a load of hogwash. We don't actually know what those letters say because it's loaded with Greek mythology. What a bunch of junk. So it's interesting that then we would begin to try to formulate doctrine and we would try to trust the experts who very possibly had their ancestors shake their fists at God. And that began the process of this translational bias, where a Reformed Christian will demand that the Bible be translated in this way, or a Presbyterian will demand that the Bible be translated this way. Remember our friend, John Nelson Darby, who formulated the doctrine of the rapture, who came up with that garbage, and also with dispensationalism, because he couldn't understand how a covenant can augment a covenant. He couldn't understand how one was built upon another. Now, before you think that I'm a covenant theologist, you're wrong. All covenants are in achad with each other, not subservient to each other, and one doesn't make one better than the other. In fact, a lot of the times they just repeat each other. For example, we have the Torah spoken at Mount Sinai to the children of Israel. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, right? And then what do we have? In the renewed covenant, Jeremiah chapter 31 through 34, we have what? It being written upon our hearts. Well, according to Paul, if a Gentile does the things of the law, he shows himself to be a law unto himself, and that the Torah is written on his heart, which means what? He's part of the new covenant. So there you go. New covenant, you do the law. Why is this so difficult for people? Why is it so out there? Generations. The seminaries don't even know what they're teaching anymore. They're just teaching the ancient wisdom that the forefathers or the founding fathers of that university had. And technically that came from what? From Lutheran and Calvinistic orders, which were both under who? Augustine. Who was what? He was a Gnostic. Loved the writings of Marcion, who was declared a heretic and drug half the church away with the words Old and New Testament, who happened to also be an anti-Semitic, along with his buddy Tertullian, who believed that Marcion was not Marcion, but who believed that Praxis was a heretic. I'm not saying Praxis wasn't a heretic, but my point is that every one of them had one thing in common. They hated Jews. But they had another thing in common too. They bought into pagan mythology, which then integrated itself into Christianity, which is why we have what? Christmas, Easter. We have a holiday that's supposed to represent the death, burial, and resurrection of our Messiah, named after Astara, a god, who's not supposed to be on my lips. And yet, every time we come to April, May, we say that name over and over and over and over again. And then we dye eggs that if a child was to find the egg, that was the one who they sacrificed. That way they didn't have to worry about who the child was. They didn't say, there would be no bias on how, it would be like a lottery. Anyways, how much of that is generations? How much of that is imprinted upon your DNA? Remember, trauma, limiting beliefs, and entitlement are imprinted on your DNA and are destructive. Why? Because to become the change that this world needs, there's two things that you're going to need. Number one, you're going to need the humility to admit that you're the problem when no one else will. When everyone else is operating in their entitlement and thinking that they're just that they're just the thing, you know, God's gift to humanity. Or they're operating in the sense that because they're a good patriot, or because they are a good friend, or because they are a good worker, that they're a good person. In all reality, just dumping that DNA all over their children, all over themselves, and all over their community. You're willing to say, I'm the problem. And then it takes it a step further when we say everyone is blaming everybody else. No one is willing to be the one. Yeshua was the one. He said, I'm the problem. He said, I'm the one who needs to change, and went and died. And he didn't need to do a thing, but he did it so that you could take that merit and become who you need to be. He enabled humanity to become the change that this world needs. He enabled believers to become the change that this world needs. So when the rest of the world is going, when is somebody going to change this? I can't afford to do it. I don't have the time. I don't have the emotional energy, and I definitely don't think they deserve it. Do you know David, Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, all of those people actually determined that this world, and Moses and Noah determined that this world was not worthy of that merit, but Yeshua did. Yeshua took it all the way. Said, okay, I love them, right? For God so loved the world, right? I love them Therefore, I'm going to carry this through. Is it on desert? No, none of you deserve it. Because all you've done is spread that mess that your generations have imprinted on you. See, you think it's because maybe, your alcoholic father was abusive to you when you were a kid, when the truth is it was probably his alcoholic fathers. And you have this idea that you get to blame that on somebody. When the truth is if you want to be the change that this world needs, you need to break that. Now, does an alcoholic father mean that you should not be drinking? No, it means you should drink in control. Demonstrate that you have mastery over it. Don't go out there and start drinking just because I told you that. You understand the principle that I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that there is a mastery that needs to occur. Remember, we learned that with lecha. Rule over yourself. Rule for the sake of yourself. Because why? Malchut HaShamayim is within us. The kingdom of heaven is within us. So when we're talking about generations, we have a past, present, and future. Yes, of course. You are the current generation. They are the past generation, and they are the future generation. Now, when I'm pointing like that, that may not be how you see the past, present, and future. But what I'm trying to say is that principle of the past, present, and future are the generations. When Yahweh says, I'm a jealous God, I visit the sins of the fathers on the third and fourth generation, this is what I want you to think about. How many people say there's such a thing as a generational curse? I cannot tell you how so far from the truth that is. There isn't a generational curse, there's a generational sin. And when you sin, then you bring that curse. But see, everybody has the opportunity to not do it. Yeshua had to be, listen, in order for him to create the merit that is present today, where we have an opportunity to have mastery over Malchut HaShamayim, have mastery over the sons of Adam, have dominion over this earth. You need to understand that he had to be capable of the sins of his fathers. And you say, oh, well, but yeah, he was born of a virgin, blah, 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 blah. Okay, look. If Yeshua was not capable of sinning the way you sin, he had no business dying for you. Because where does he have the temptation to overcome? It says he was always tempted, but did not sin. That means that he was capable of sin. That means that he had an element within him where he could have continued in those generations, but he didn't. And he proved that you could do it. He proved that you could overcome it. He proved that you do not have to listen to your limiting beliefs, entitlements, and traumas that may predate your birth. Why is this so important? Because when we are dealing with the change that this world needs, you need to understand the kingdom of darkness is 10 times ahead of us, governing this cosmic flow of energy. Remember, energy before it comes to a human is not polarized. We polarize it. We're the ones who decide whether it's good or evil, and we're the ones who make it into something bad or good. And what are those words, bad and good, in the Hebrew? What is the knowledge of good and evil? There are 3 operative words you need to know. Tov, Ra, and Da'at. Da'at, the word knowledge, is a hidden element of God. Only kings are able to seek it. Do you see? You are supposed to become something great, and you are supposed to overcome this generational sin, and you are supposed to then become the change that this world needs, because until we do, it's just going to keep going like this. Solomon said it. He said, there's nothing new under the sun, and I have seen a great evil under the sun, that a man will toil his whole life to give something to his children, and some wicked one will receive it after he dies. When it is supposed to be that the wealth of the wicked is compiled for the righteous. The wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Means what? That we will actually take upon ourselves the identity of the righteousness of God, and therefore have legitimate entitlement to Malchut HaShamayim, the kingdom of heaven, the rulership of heaven, but also be allowed to have that wealth. You can't have that wealth within merit. Don't get me wrong. Yahweh said to test him in your giving, right? He told the priest that. He said, you need to bring in the tithe and see if your storehouse isn't filled. Listen, I'm the first one to understand how hard it is to be a good steward of money. But you need to understand that's the letter of Torah. That is not the spirit of Torah. What was the spirit of Torah? That the poor be taken care of, that the widows and orphans be taken care of. Listen, no offense to anybody who's got this idea in their head that they've got to go help this poor guy. But you need to look a little closer to home before you start venturing out. Long time ago, I would sit there and people would be praying for people over in Africa. And I would say, where is that in your circle of influence? Who are you not praying for that's in your circle of influence right now because you're too busy trying to pray for the world? What ridiculousness. He gave you a circle of influence for a reason. That's your responsibility. That's your area. That's your tool set, etc. Okay. So I've mentioned the word generations a significant amount of times. And it's time that we begin to try to look at this a little bit. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go into the book of Exodus. Now, usually, generally speaking, we don't enter a season before it's time, but almost everyone, and I mean everyone, knows the Ten Commandments. So as we go into the Ten Commandments now, we're looking at very specifically verse 5 of Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5 says, thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. I, Yahweh, thy Elohim, am a jealous Elohim, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. Now, in the Hebrew, when we go into this idea of generations, what you need to know is that it doesn't actually mention the word generations the way that you think it would, but instead it talks about the children. Okay, it says of the fathers upon the children unto the third and the fourth. Doesn't say generations. See, that word generations doesn't have any Hebrew word next to it. See, we have a Hebrew word here and we have a Hebrew word here, but we do not have a Hebrew word for the word generations. Whoops, right there, generations. See, it jumps back to a search. Now, what does that mean? That means we need to understand that this is not necessarily about father to son, but instead has to do with significant generations or significant children in that set. Could be the third and fourth of that same group. For example, let's talk about Jacob, right? Jacob has these 12 sons. All of them are contemporary to each other. Sins of the fathers is visited on the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. How do we know? Well, listen to it. We have who? We have Reuben, who disqualified himself from the inheritance as the firstborn through what? Through sleeping with his father's concubine, right? Then we have Levi and Simeon, who disqualify themselves from their inheritance, from their birthright, through what? The sin of Shechem, where they had Shechem circumcise themselves, right? And then went and killed them because of their sister. And then we have Judah. We have Judah, who is the fourth of that group, who ends up becoming the bloodline of the Messiah. So 3 generations or 3 sons later, Judah finally gets the inheritance. Because why? Because the heel grabber present in Levi and Simeon, the heel grabber present in Reuben, created darkness in those children. So it doesn't have to be Jacob's children's children's children, but it can be Jacob's sons, right? This is important. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it stays just in that lineage, right? Those first 12 children. Why? Because we know that the children of Israel, as they leave the land of Egypt, leave as a very great number of people. So, as we are moving through this thought process, I wanted you to see that it doesn't use the word generations. That's why that is in italics, is because it doesn't actually exist in the Hebrew. However, the word generations itself is present within this system in this week's parasha. Okay? And when I say system, you will see that this is a very mechanical process. Okay? So, jumping into Genesis chapter 25, verse 19, we will see that it says, "And these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac." Okay, so now when we go into the Hebrew, this is what we see. The word Toldot, which consequently, if we go to the First Fruits of Zion website, we will encounter that word Toldot here, Genesis 25:19 through 28:9. That is the Torah portion. So when we're talking about generations, you can see that there is an element. There's a couple elements that are necessary, but that is the name of this week's parasha. Now, is there a convenience to the fact? Let me stay there for a second. Is there a convenience to the fact that that's the name of this week's Torah portion? Whether you choose to believe me or not, I did not remember that this week was Toldot. But all week, the Father has been dealing with me about generational curses. I was trying to understand them. I was trying to get my mind wrapped around the process. And that's when he began to help me understand that it is not the curse. It is the sin that is imprinted on the DNA. But that sin, listen, just for a moment, let's get our minds wrapped around the idea of sin in a Hebrew understanding. In Hebrew understanding, the idea behind sin has to do with how far you are from a target. okay? The word Torah comes from a root word that means to shoot something straight or to cast a finger in a certain direction, and that person go in that direction to the best of their ability. But the premise is that there is an archery element here. And that archery element or sling element is the idea of how close they are to a target. Not how far away they were, but how close they are. Okay? And so in principle, the whole concept behind sin is a measurement of how close you have come to where you need to be. And so sin is an indicator of your progress. Somebody be like, you're out of your mind. Sin is my failure. No, it isn't. Sin shows you that you have yet to overcome this thing, but that it's where the Father wants you to become a master. The archer doesn't walk up to the target and think in his mind, I am not going to be very good at this, and I need to make sure that I figure out how far away I have failed. An archer approaches the target and practices over and over and over, missing the mark. But each time believing in their hearts, oh, I got that much closer. How many of you, when you sin, think to yourselves, oh, I got that much closer? You don't. Because that goes back to that thought process of what the world has created sin to be. Remember, sin separates you from God. Remember, sin casts you into hell. Remember, sin attracts the devil and is the devil's work. When the truth is that James says that you were led away of your own lust, and lust, when it is conceived, becomes sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, becomes death. What is death? Death is the realm of lack and decrease, where you are not the head, but you are the tail, where you do not have the protection when you have an enemy come at you and you flee from him 5 ways, instead of him coming at you and he flee from you 5 ways. Nobody has that process present in their brains. They don't understand that you are the one who makes the choice to sin. Remember, Ezekiel said the fathers eat the grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, the fathers eat the grapes and the children taste the sourness in their mouth. No. Ezekiel says you will die in your own sin. What does that mean? What is death? Remember, death is an interruption, right? A mark in chaos, a mark on the timeline. It creates a beginning and an end. You learned that last week. But why is this so important? Because when we are dealing with this word, Toldot, and the reason why I showed you it in the first fruits of Zion thing is because obviously there was a premise there that, oh, it's awful convenient. You're talking about generations, and this happens to be the Torah portion. Well, to be honest with you, until last night when I actually saw it during the Midrash, I said, oh, wow, okay, that makes total sense now. Why God has been dealing with me about epigenetics, why he's been dealing with me about timeline, why he's been dealing with me about the fact that there is damage present in you because of your father's choices, because of your grandfather's choices, because of his grandfather's choices. So is it a matter of breaking a curse? Now all of a sudden you're not going to be sick anymore. Now all of a sudden the oath that your grandfather said in the Masonic temple has been broken. When are you going to realize that you have hell? You have the devil, you have the Trinity, you have the practice of Christmas and Easter imprinted on your DNA. You want to talk about curse? Let me tell you what the Torah says. The Torah says that you shall not learn the customs of the nations, but you will appear before me 3 times a year during Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Those of you who are new to this, I'm sure you got plans for Christmas, but I'm willing to bet you didn't even touch upon the Feast of Tabernacles. because you were told something different than what is actually present in the Torah, in the scripture. So we're going to get into this word Toldot, okay? But I want you to understand that when we are dealing with this idea of being unseated from your authority, unseated from your energy, and unseated from your collective conscience, you need to understand that the kingdom of darkness has not been unseated from these things. And when you manipulate natural order processes in order to bring about a influence upon human behavior for a malevolent purpose, you are a witch. But when you manipulate natural order processes like healing a disease to bring about a change in human behavior, why? You need a sign to prove that the things you're saying are true. That's what it says in Scripture. Is it a wicked and perverse generation that seeks after a sign? Yeah. Blessed are those who see, or those who do not see but yet believe. But I promise you, the generations will not believe you. Remember, it's a wicked and perverse generation. We're going to get into that word. Who seeks after a sign. But the premise is that you need a sign to establish your words. Those words will be the words of Yahweh, the instruction of Yahweh, a demonstrative element to your whole process of a believer. Has nothing to do with you going and sitting in the pew on Sunday morning or showing up for Christmas and Easter. It has to do with the idea that you are trying to bring about a spiritual evolution to this world that's coming regardless of whether you want it to or not. But we do not want it to come in the kingdom of darkness. There is a sentiment and a belief that revelation is written in stone, that it has to come to pass. Why then would Yeshua die for those who are lost? Yeshua died so that people would have a chance, and that chance is an option, a will that we choose or don't choose. But for those of you who read the book of Revelation and can't wait for it, you don't understand that you are bringing it to pass. You are the problem. You are the one bringing the curse, the wrath, all of those elements. And so when we identify that there is actually something that needs to change, in your mind, you don't want it to change. You want it to get worse. And who cares anyways, because God's supposedly going to whisk you away. What a load of hogwash. It is a rapture-induced death stupor to prevent you from being effective. And it was all based on logic. A lack of mythos, a lack of energy and power and collective conscience. Could we call it a conspiracy of the devil? Sure, fine. I'm good with that. Absolutely. Absolutely, I'm good with that. Because in its simplicity, we don't understand the level at which humans have manipulated this stuff. And Abba has given a very, very, very specific instruction concerning it, and has given us a lot of grace. Remember, he's having patience with those vessels of wrath so that he can demonstrate his mercy to the vessels of honor. And so as we work through this, we begin to understand that there is not a point here where you begin to think that you're something special, but instead that you begin to understand what a problem you really actually are to this world. You're dumping your DNA information all over this world. Thank you very much. Guess what? I am too, on a regular basis. I am carrying generations of bad ideas and bad choices and making those same choices because it's what my body thinks and knows and wants to operate in. So let's take a look at this word. Getting back into the Hebrew, we have this word Toldot. Toldot just so happens to be a construct, which means the word of is attached to it. So then if we go into the Hebrew, we have the word Toldot, descendants, results, proceedings, generations, genealogies. You can see that it was used 39 times in Torah, right? As generations, and 1 time as the word birth. Okay. Now, getting into our usage, our first usage is Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that Yahweh made the earth and the heavens. Okay. All right. Here we go. Jumping into our root, it is Yaled or Yalad. Let's go ahead and let's begin to document these things on the board. So obviously we have our Yod, we have our Lamed, right? And we have our Dalet. Now, of course, for those of you who need to be reminded, if you have a Yod, if you have a Hey, if you have a Vav, if you have an Aleph, or if you have a doubled last letter, okay, then you basically have what? You have a child root. What does that mean? That we can instantaneously drop one of these and find the parent root. So it's real simple. We can drop the Yod, right? At least that seems to be the most logical path with this. Leaving the Lamed Dalet. Well, before we get into the actual ancient pictographic Hebrew, I'll remind you, the Lamed is a shepherd's crook. Go ahead and do that in a different color. I know that learnings are attached to colors, so we will go ahead and do our best to preserve some learnings here by using different colors. Okay, here we go. So the Lamed is a shepherd's crook, and the Dalet is the drawing of a tent door. Okay, that's going to be the short and easy version of this. We'll just write this here, shepherd's crook. Okay, and we'll just write door here. And actually, that's right, tent door. That's going to be important because remember, the tent door is also a wall, which means it's also a what? A chet. Anyways, that's what we got to work with, right? Okay, so we would assume that it's something to do with what? Authority and something to do with the tent door. Okay, so that's going to be our assumptions. Let's go into the lexicon. Before we do that, let me just take a moment to explain something to you. The Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible, compiled by Jeff Benner, is a combination of both the parent root and the stems that come off of it, or the child and adopted roots that come off of it. What's important for you to understand is the result of a lot of research in finding these pottery shards and connecting these words to these ancient pictographic parent roots is very relevant. In fact, even James Strong understood a little bit about this because oftentimes you will find a lexical root and it'll say from an unused PRIM. People think that's the prime root. No, primitive root. James understood that there was another language that he was not able to necessarily connect into his Strong's Concordance. So in that process, there's a couple of things that we need to do. The first one is obviously we're going to go into the ancient pictographic Hebrew. We're going to go into the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, and we're going to identify the actual meaning based upon a compilation of the child and adopted roots. But sometimes, and I don't know if this is the case in this one, but sometimes the parent root does not make sense. Remember, the word light and order are connected with the aleph and the resh. The aleph and the resh being what? The ox's head and the human head, meaning what? Strong mind. What has that got to do with light and order? The ancients understood something. We are trying to find that out. Why? Because knowledge is hidden. And it is the glory of kings to seek it out. So you can either be great and seek it out, or you can stay in this rat race. Okay? All right, here we go. So we're just going to jump right into the lexicon. All we're going to do is we're just going to copy the Strong's Concordance number, jump over to the digital copy of the lexicon. Looks like we have to get into the lexicon first. Okay. And then we are going to paste that in there. And of course, since we're only dealing with the Hebrew, we have to get rid of the H because there's an H and a G, the Hebrew and the Greek. But the ancient Hebrew lexicon only deals with the Hebrew, and therefore that's the Strong's number we're looking for. And of course, then we jump in over there and we have our word, right? And it is the bring forth, yalad, to issue out or bring forth children, either by the woman who bears them or the man who fathers them, or what? The form or the intensive form of somebody acting as a midwife. Okay, but then when we get into the ancient pictographic Hebrew parent root, including highlighting the Hebrew here, we have the concrete as child. Notice, however, again, what have we seen here, you guys? Let me take this completely off and then I will highlight specific parts. What have we seen in the past few parashas, all the way from Bereshit, where I said, look, we have an aleph, we have a resh, we have an ox's head and a human head, and yet this is the word light. Well, now we have the word child, and it has something to do with a shepherd's crook and a door. But then we have something even more disturbing or off the wall, and that is that the ancient nomadic lifestyle definition is simply just childbearing. But how is a lamed and a dalet connected to that process? Again, we have arrived at yet another mystery. Another mystery. Okay, and so in that, we have to seek this out. Do you guys see a pattern here? Look, I've been doing this for years. I have been doing this since 2007. And I can tell you that I have been teaching this since probably 2014. And so what you need to understand is that I have never realized the importance of the fact that there is actually what? Hidden mysteries in the fact that these pictographic parent roots do not match the definitions of their children and adopted children. The roots don't match the stems when it comes to the drawings. When I say we are in a new season, we are in a new season. So let's talk a minute about Lech Lecha, right? That's one of the parashas that we recently looked at, and that was where we realized that there needed to be self-mastery present in this strong mind. It had a purpose. It was to be have self-mastery, to rule over self. But that wasn't supposed to be some big old self-denial, self-loathing, body-beating process, but instead one in which you became a master at those things that you needed to practice, and specifically those things that you had to overcome. And those things that you had to overcome were actually what? Those were the failures in your life. Those things that you overcome, then you became what? A master of, and therefore a teacher of how to overcome them. That's powerful. So we can see how the lamed is going to play a role here. But what about the dalet? let's talk a minute about the dalet. So going back to our board, we're going to go ahead and put some things here. The first thing that we're going to put here is we're going to talk about this, which most of you know this illustration. Most of you understand how this is going to go, right? And so I usually do what? I do the, we'll go ahead and get rid of this. I usually do the dotted line to show that the tent actually has 4 walls, right? If we were to put it on its end, this is how it would look. 1, 2, 3, 4 walls. Okay. And there would be an entrance and there would be a separate area. This would be the service area, the kitchen. This would be kind of the place where the wife would operate, and this would be the sleeping area here, right? And this would be the awning would usually come out like this, and the man would sit here under his awning in his tent during the heat of the day in order to avoid the heat from hurting him, and then he would go work more closer to sundown as it started to cool down or in the early morning. That, of course, is what? This. Which is what? The bait. Modern English B. Okay? But enough about that stuff, because really, technically, what we are more concerned with and what we really need to get our minds wrapped around is the principle of the tent door. So there's a couple things that you need to think about when it comes to the tent door. The first is obviously what? That we have a moving in. And actually, I'm going to do this differently. We're going to do red. We're going to do red for out. And we're going to do yellow for, or I'm sorry, no. We're going to do green for in. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Green for in. Okay, this is what I want you to think about. Out here is the field. Okay. For some reason, that doesn't look right spelling-wise, but okay, whatever. We'll just leave it alone. Field. Okay, out here's the field, right? According to Yeshua, the field is the world. According to the Hebrew word that we looked at last week, the parent root that we looked at last week, there is this idea of taming the outside, right? Inside, and we'll go ahead and write it in green, we have what? We have provision. The bellies are full, which means life, right? We have protection, right? And we have what? We have instruction. That's what's inside the tent. But see, this is just a symbol of that process. Because why? Here's the deep part. Remember, kingdom of heaven is within you. Peter said, this is a tent. Which means what? Provision, protection, instruction is present within this. Outside of this needs to be tamed. Within this is supposed to be in order, provision, protection, and instruction. Okay? And that means that there would be a center pole that would be what? The strength of the tent. It would hold up the tent. That's the word of. or Father. Then we have the idea of the tent being held together. Remember, there were goat hair panels that were glued together with bone glue. Remember, bones are boiled. The stuff is skimmed off the top, and it is glue. It is used to press the goat skin, the goat hair panels together. That is the glue, or the strong water, which is what? That's the ima. That's the mother. So within you is the father and the mother, which is obviously the masculine and feminine principle. That's a given, but you need to also understand that that's your generations within you as well, because you're the tent. Now watch. Out here needs to be tamed. What's out here? That's your perception. You look at the world a certain way. According to John, it is the pride of life, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes. It's a scarcity mentality, realizing what you don't have and what you want. And it's a belief that you are entitled to something that you're not entitled to. Why? Because he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. It is not about merit. That is not why you deserve something. That is not why you receive something. And don't get me wrong, faith brings the birthright, obedience brings the blessing. But I'm not talking about blessing here, am I? I'm talking about mastery. But there's more. And so in this process of provision, protection, and instruction, there are 4 walls. Each one of those is a chet, a separator that prevents you from being exposed to what? To the world. That's going to come in the form of provision, protection, and instruction. Provision and protection and instruction is what preserves you from the world, which is what? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. You cannot receive instruction if you have pride. You cannot receive protection if you are lusting after the things you do not have. Why? Because you will seek them in an inappropriate manner. Remember, Yeshua said, don't be anxious for these things. That's what the nations do. You know what that Hebrew word is? That Hebrew word is goy. You know what it's translated into the Greek as? Gentile. Ethnos. Meaning what? Those of you who call yourselves Christian Gentiles or Gentile Christians, guess what you're saying? You're saying you're like the nations who what? Who have anxiety over what they would eat, what they would drink, and what they would wear. According to Yeshua, that is not supposed to be. So in principle, obviously, we get into trust. Does the tent contain trust? Yes, absolutely. But now we get to the door. We get to the door. We get to what? We get to the portal. You see, your mind does 3 things. It very, very, in a lazy manner, takes information and categorizes it into general categories. For example, if you have a red pillow in your mind, you have a red car, you have a red bathrobe. Those things are all red. Well, what if you like the color red? Then you have a bias towards that generalization of red. What if you don't like red? Then you have a bias against that generalization of red. What does this mean? That means that your mind creates categories, but there's emotional attachments to those categories, which can create limiting beliefs, can create entitlements, and trauma can have a very lasting and intense effect upon those biases. When we are dealing with these things, the other thing that we do is we tweak the information to fit our model. You were taught the Nicene Creed. You were taught about hell, and you were taught about Satan, and you were taught about the Trinity, and you were taught about Christ, and you were taught about all of the different things that are involved in Christian doctrine and understanding. And that created a bias about the world, about things, about information, where all of a sudden you're supposedly opening doors. You're giving opportunity to the devil. You know, it's funny. If you study out the places where it says, don't give place to the devil, there's about 3. Okay. One of them has to do with the law of Nidah, where you separate from your wife intimately while she has her monthly visitor. And then you quickly come together afterwards because of what? The possibility that you would give place to what? The devil. Anger. Be angry and sin not, lest you give place to the devil, right? Same principle. And so you could see how, and I can't remember the third one, you could see how this premise of these things is all kind of distorted into how you perceive the world around you, when the truth is that when we talk about opening doors or opening ourselves up to things or all those kind of things, it's just the pulpit jabbing their jibs. There's nothing in Scripture about it. Why is it important? Because you need to have an open mind to what I'm teaching. And when I say you need to have an open mind to what I'm teaching, I'm not talking about some sort of ego trip where I think that I am right. You need to have an open mind to the fact that here's yet another pictograph that contains a whole bunch of stems that are in the Strong's Concordance, that are translated in the King James Version of the Bible, which Strong concorded his concordance to. See, one is linked to the other, to the other, to the other, which was translationally biasedly translated. Okay, that was kind of redundant. Was biasedly translated by people who believed a certain way and believed that that's how that word should be translated based upon their doctrine and not upon that pictograph. So let's talk about the door. If you are somebody who is in shame, you have gone out the door and you have been exposed to nakedness, right? To dryness and to shame. What is shame? Shame is a painful emotion caused by guilt. What is guilt? Guilt is a cognition or a perception that you have done something wrong, whether you have or have not. That's guilt. And so the principle is that shame is a painful emotion caused by guilt that you carry, guilt that you should not carry if you are in the identity of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God. Don't get me wrong. Humans have done a thorough job of trying to punish people for their sins. And therefore, there's probably still a reality where you are answering for things you've done wrong. But in the scheme of the kingdom of heaven and how you were chosen and the change that this world needs and who you are becoming, I promise you, there is no record of your wrong. That's a tough road to hoe, because some of you have done some horrible things. And in that process of doing those horrible things, you carry that burden of guilt, no matter what you try to do. So we have this idea. And let me go ahead and illustrate this on the board, actually. So if we're going to get into this, we need to go ahead and go with this idea of the, I've switched this color so many times, I'm just going to put it back to, we'll just go with blue. So we have the sheen, right? And then we have the vav, and then we have the beit, right? And so we have what? We can drop the vav. Why? Because this is a parent root, or I mean, this is a child root. And so what we have is sheen beit, right? Which is what? 2 front teeth, right? Here's our guy. Right? There's our 2 front teeth. He needs a nose. Okay, nose doesn't go there. There we go. All right. And then we have what? We have the house or the tent, right? We have the tent. All right. And so in principle, what is this? This is what? Press to what? The tent. right? Press the tent or press to the tent. What is this word? Repentance. Okay. And then we have what? We have the bait, we have the vav, and we have the sheen. Okay. And that sheen, which I know my Hebrew's horrible. Drop that. What do we have? We have tent. Okay. And we have press. Two front teeth. Our dude with the big old grin. That's even worse. All right. And so what do we have? Press away from the tent, which is what? The word for shame. Remember, he was naked and unashamed, and then he realized he was naked. That's the word bush. Bush. Okay. So we have repentance. We have the idea of going into the tent, pressing into the tent. Going into the tent is what? That is repentance. That is returning. That is the idea of going back to and becoming Torah observant, receiving the instruction with joy instead of believing that it is a pressure and a curse and a drama in your life. Right? Accepting the provision of God, receiving the protection from God, trusting him. Remember our Hebrew word betach, right? And then we have what? Shame. We have going outside the tent, right? We have leaving the tent, going outside the tent into what? The world, into the field. Okay? Into the field. Becoming what? The problem. Becoming the drama. Pressing away from the tent, pressing away from the provision, protection, and instruction, pressing away from Torah, pressing away from the trust of God, pressing away from the abundance. Because either we're not worthy of it or we feel entitled to it. Because if you feel entitled to it, it will not seek you out. Because I'm going to share something with you. The cosmos is attracted to those who are humble. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be some sort of it doesn't mean you can't be decisive. It doesn't mean that you can't call something for what it is. Okay? But it means that when it comes to your material wealth and abundance, you need to understand, number one, it's not yours. Number two, it was given to you. It was not earned. And number three, it can go away. And when it goes away, you need to continue to operate in the operation that you had when it was there, in your service and walk with the Father. Remember, Paul said, I know how to be rich, and I know how to be poor. I know how to be in lack, and I know how to be in increase. So when we're getting into this thought process of the tent, we need to understand that the tent door moves in two different directions. Remember the word echad. Hebrew word echad is aleph, chet, dalet. We drop that because what? That is the child root indicator, and we are left with what? A tent wall and a tent door, which it means wall door, and literally means to connect the inside and the outside. The door brings unity. How does it? Because this is the word for unity, right? Or a unit. Remember, this is the Hebrew word one, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. One. It's a unit of something. Okay? And so, in principle, then, as we look at this idea of wall door, we know that the outside and the inside are being connected. Now, we know that there is a Hebrew obligation to tame the world. Why? There is a sentiment that you go out of the tent to do a routine. What is that Hebrew word? That Hebrew word is ruach, spirit, where we have the drawing of a human head and the drawing of a tent wall. Resh chet. So now watch how this works. So in principle then, as we understand how the door operates, it creates a unity between what? Repentance and shame. Now you say, well, why would you want both? Well, remember, shame is a painful emotion that is attached to guilt. Remember that shame lets you know that that you're guilty of something. Now, what you need to examine is that guilt merited or not? If it is merited, then cry out for mercy. If it isn't merited, stand your ground and tell the accuser who he is. Do you know how many times somebody has made a decision about my worth based upon my past, and I have had to stand there and say, my conscience is clear. My conscience is clear, and you are wrong. And you will find out that you're wrong in the worst way. Because remember, what you judge upon another has to be measured out to you. You will fall into the same judgment of those who you have judged. I promise you that. I have experienced that so much in my life, I'm scared of it. Okay, so the principle is that the wall door creates unity, right? And so the idea is that the door unites the inside and the outside. It's the only way to access both areas. Remember, we are to go outside the tent to tame the outside. We are supposed to come into the tent to receive provision, protection, and instruction. And we are never supposed to be in a permanent state of this or a permanent state of this. You want to know what a permanent state of this is? Let me draw it for you. If you have that symbol in your home, on your body, in your ear, on a necklace, on your car, you are still in a state of repentance. Because I don't know if you realize it, but number one, that is very possibly not how he died. But also, and it's very important, that is pagan symbol. It has its origins in runes from Norse mythology, and it has its origins in phallic symbols. It can be traced all the way back to Egypt, which means we're getting into Egyptian magic. But I promise you, your sentiment concerning it is death, not life. There's nothing alive on that cross. So when I say that you are in a state of repentance, you are stuck at the cross, is because you still think that there's such a thing as a salvation issue. When the intensification of all power in the universe gives you 75 years to get it right, and if you don't, he's going to punish you for eternity, that is not a God I am willing to serve. Let me make that abundantly clear. I will not serve that God. And so when I am touching upon these things, you need to understand I already have a bias. I already realize where we have constructs, Catholic constructs, Milton and Dante, Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno plays a role in your theology today. And so when we start to get our minds wrapped around this, and we start to realize that we are dealing with human constructs when we are supposed to be dealing with upper worlds. Remember, Paul said, don't mind the things below, but the things above. When's the last time you minded something above besides heaven, which is just waiting to die? Which consequently, you show me in scripture where it says you go to heaven. You don't, ever. And so in that whole process, one of the things that we need to get our minds wrapped around is the idea that basically what we've got going on here is that the Lamed Dalet, it means childbirth, is some sort of coming into existence. But in the mind and heart of the ancient, It was a shepherd's crook and a door. Shepherd crook means authority. Let's talk a minute about that. Remember, the ancient nomad was what? He was he was pastoral, not urban. Remember, in his process, he was able to take his property, his animals, and his food and move to the next place where there wasn't a drought. Abraham did it often. And so as a result of that, we need to understand that although there is nothing wrong with a permanent home, because Torah says that when God finally brings you into your inheritance, achetz, right? Remember, achetz is an aleph, a resh, and a tzadeh. The resh and tzadeh is the idea of running. Rutz is the word for run in modern Hebrew. If I'm going to go for a run, it's rutz, right? But here's the thing about it. Add the aleph, and it's what? Where the strong one has ran, right? And it's the whole idea of that place where you tread. That's the inheritance of someone. Land, translated in the English, land. But in the Hebrew, the thought process is where you tread your foot. Remember, God told Abraham, you go to and fro throughout the land that I am giving you, right? Okay, but now, moving into that process, we have this idea then that the inheritance, right, that when you come into your inheritance, you come into the land I'm giving you, you will dwell in houses you have not built. Yahweh knew that they would go from a tent to a house, which means what? The whole thing is here. The temporary dwelling is here. The tent is here. The ability to move and go where we need to go in order to find the provision, protection, and instruction. Yes, amen. But to follow the water, right? Remember, the droughts affected how Abraham moved. The droughts affected how Jacob moved, etc. And so in that whole process, what you need to think about is that all that was mental. That had nothing to do with the fact that Abraham was a tent dweller. There was a philosophy behind it that was important. And that philosophy said that the highest order of human was the Sar, or what? The clan leader. Remember, Sarah means princess. Sarah, female clan leader. Sarah is female clan leader. Sar is Hebrew for clan leader or prince. And in the sentiment, the way that you want to look at it is like this. They held the shepherd's crook that had the list of generations. Jacob's staff had Isaac's name on it, and Abraham's name on it, and Noah's name on it, and Lamech's name on it. And I'm not going to go through that entire 10 generations back to Adam. But it had Adam all the way down the staff to Jacob. And so when Jacob walks into a situation with that staff, it demonstrates that he's the clan leader and therefore the highest authority or sovereign. Nobody above Jacob was to make a decision about that clan. So shepherd's crook is about authority, which brings us back to our original discussion about what Hasatan, or the adversary, is trying to unseat a believer from, whatever that energy may be. Whether that be a personality, whether that be a force, whether that be us. Remember, Yeshua said to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan." So we're very capable of being it. But in that principle, then what we need to accept is that's trying to unseat our authority. Then we need to understand what authority is. We need to understand dominion. We need to understand how we are supposed to govern. And that's going to start here and work its way outward. Malchut Hashamayim, the rulership of heaven, or the kingdom of heaven, is here. Okay? So, in that thought, then we now can take the Lamed, the shepherd's crook, and the Dalet, and put them together, and all of a sudden what we have is we have the person who guards the door. In principle, the way that you want to think about it is you decide when that door swings in and when that door swings out, and you do not permit the open access of it. You see, if it was the Dalet by itself, then that would be different. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go take a look at the Hebrew, ancient Hebrew language and alphabet book. Let me go ahead and pull that up real quick. That's the book that was open when we first started today. And what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to the Lamed Dalet and see what it actually says. And then we will go over to the Dalet Lamed, and I will show you the opposite spelling. Okay. So let's get there first. That is going to be Lamed Dalet here. Okay. The bearing of children or birthing, right? That's the Lamed Dalet right there. Okay. In the ancient pictographic Hebrew right there. Okay. Now, going back to Dalet Lamed, then basically what we have is we have the opposite spelling, but what does it mean? What does Dalet Lamed mean? And this is the part where we can get into some interesting wisdom, and just by reversing the letters. Okay. So in this case, we have Dalet Lamed, door on a staff. The tent door was hung down as a curtain covering the entrance to the tent from a horizontal pole or staff. The door was then moved to the side for going in and out of the tent. Any object that dangles, such as a bucket that is hung from a rope down a well to retrieve water, the hair hangs from the head, a poor or weak person hangs the head in poverty, anything that dangles down and swings back and forth, such as a bucket, a branch from a tree, or a door. What can we gain from that? Well, what's interesting is that's the Hebrew word or name for the Dalet. What do I mean by that? Dalet Lamed, is the name for that. And so that's actually contained in this week's parasha in the sense that the word, the Hebrew letter itself is the name Dal, therefore has the hidden Lamed. I know that's a little bit confusing, but bear with me. All right, so the principle is that if we just take and switch them, remember that idea of the place of honor and all of those things, like to the right of everything is the place of honor. Therefore, that's the letter that augments the letter. Therefore, in this case, the shepherd's crook is augmenting the door, meaning what? It's the door, it's the authority of the door. But when we flip it around, it's the door of authority. And then what's interesting is in that principle, then we have some interesting things going on. As we move the letters around, all of a sudden something's hanging down. All of a sudden something's dangling, including the head of someone who's in poverty, which is the opposite of provision, which means what? They're operating in the scarcity mentality. Why? Because Yahweh said, test me. He said, if you give, I will give you more. That's the premise. That's the simplicity of it. You can't outgive God. I recently had somebody come to me who is poverty stricken, and they actually gave me a tithe. I was shocked to realize that they didn't even have enough money to fill their gas tank and yet gave me a tithe because they believe so much in the obedience to the tithing. Now, some people will go, oh, yeah, that just makes you a televangelist, right? That just makes you somebody who's asking for money. I've never asked. And if you had any idea how much money I actually need right now, it'd blow your mind. as we have gone through the processes, we do not operate in scarcity mentality because we lose our abundance, right? We will be operating like the guy who buried the money in the ground instead of investing it. Isn't it interesting that Yeshua is talking about the kingdom of heaven and talks about investments, and specifically the money market, the foreign exchange market? Interestingly enough, how Yeshua equates everything in his parables to wealth, whether it be the field, whether it be the pearl of great price, whether it be the coin that was lost. Seems like maybe there might be some subtle discussions concerning abundance in that situation. But I digress. Let's get back to the thought process here. So the premise is that we have the shepherd's crook and we have the door. So we're governing the door. We're governing the shame and we're governing the repentance. We're governing the taming of the outside versus the exposure. And we're governing the provision, protection, and instruction. Now, why would we need to govern the provision, protection, and instruction? You ever had those moments where you have gone long periods of time of hearing from God and feeling guided by him and feeling directed by him and receiving instruction and receiving powerful messages and revelation, and then all of a sudden there's this dry spell? There's this streak in which there is nothing. What happens to your mind? What's the first thing that you think? You're bad, right? When the truth is that all that has happened is a drought has happened and you are supposed to move your tent to where there is water. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole concept here, but the idea is some of that may be because you didn't not carry out your last instruction. Therefore, no more instruction is coming because you're still supposed to be carrying out that instruction. Why is this important? This is important because basically what we're looking at is the idea that sometimes you need to sit in your provision, protection, and instruction for a while before you go out of the tent. Remember, you are the tent. Meaning what? There, you may need to take some you time. Well, let me tell you what some of your you time should be about. Proving that the information that's been inscribed upon your DNA is inaccurate or is accurate. And in that process, either accenting the accuracy of it or what? Removing the power of that information from your life. Remember, Yahweh asked Adam, who told you you were naked? I want you to think about some things. The intensification of all power in the universe. Obviously, having to come into a form that is perceivable by Adam, and enough that they heard him in the garden, right? But the premise is that then they hide themselves. He says, where are you? And then what happens? Adam says, I hid from you in the garden. When I heard you in the garden, I hid from you because I am naked. Now, the intensification of all power in the universe, totally all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, says, who told you you were naked? Did anybody ever tell Adam that he was naked? That we see in the record of Torah, is there any place where it says, Adam, you're naked? And yet Yahweh asks Adam, who told you? Why was that important? Because what you need to realize is if you're the change that this world needs, you need to start realizing that you are the problem that needs to change. When I say you're the change that this world means, that doesn't mean that you go and you start a campaign against sinners. Being the change that this world needs to start in this way. Remember, the world is saying, oh, you know what? It's somebody else's fault, and I wish somebody would change it. So what do you got to do? Well, you can't say it's somebody else's fault, can you? No. So you have to take responsibility. And if you take responsibility, what does that mean? You're the problem. And if you're the real problem, if you're the entire reason that the world is messed up, then change. It takes humility. So it takes humility to enter into this. But in that process, what you need to understand is all humility is a willingness to heal from your wounds, a willingness to realize that your limiting beliefs are governed by some information that had an origin, and a willingness to realize that you are entitled to zip everything that you possess is not yours. It's somebody else's. And it's for the benefit of somebody else. You just get to be along for the ride. Now, what will really blow your skull is when you realize that your adversities are not for you. You're not going through what you're going through for your sake. You're going through what you're going through so that you will eventually overcome it and be a master of it, and therefore you can teach others how to overcome it. And therefore that means that your adversity is actually someone else's adversity, but you're learning how to help them through it. Ooh, is that a scary road? But the humility to accept provision. What does that mean? The humility to say that I don't earn it, that God just gives it. And if he chooses to turn off the faucet, he turns off the faucet. If he turns it on, then he turns it on. And I have to be a good steward of it. But I have to be good steward of one single widow's mite, right? I have to be a good steward of one single widow's mite. Remember, he says, I have not seen this in all of Israel. This woman gave all that she had. She only had 2 widow's mites. And so in principle, then, as we go through this, there's a necessary understanding of humility concerning provision. Protection does not mean that you get to go and do whatever you want. I will share something that is going to be very, very difficult with you who are listening. Your pulpit may tell you that the law has been done away with. But in your heart of hearts, remember, Torah written on your heart if you're part of the new covenant. Remember Paul saying that a Gentile who does the things of the law shows the Torah written upon his heart. Whether you are circumcised or uncircumcised, you have an obligation to be obedient to the Torah. And I'll have you know that takes humility to accept the instruction of God, to remove from your life those things which have pagan origins, to no longer be okay with the kingdom of darkness. Those of you who have an obsession and or a affinity for horror movies or horror or gore need to know that has to change. That has to change. That's not a part of you. That's a part of something else. And I will bet it's trauma. I will bet that it has something to do with limited beliefs. But in that process, you need to understand that when you become the change that this world needs and you realize you're the problem and you accept that entire burden, because no one else is going to change. That's what you need to know. No one else is going to do it but you. Now, obviously, there's a lot of yous out there. But if one of you changes, the world changes. If all the yous out there continue to say, oh, it's not my problem, it's somebody else's problem. Oh, it's not my fault, it's somebody else's fault. Oh, they need to start, and then I will change. You know how many times I've heard that? Oh, my husband, he's just a horrible man, and There's nothing I can do about it. When he changes, I'll change. How many times have I counseled a man and a wife in a marriage counseling session and heard, when this person does this, then I will do this. No, you change first. Because here's the thing. If you begin to change first and that other person doesn't change, it's very possible then that, and of course, if you've already come to me for marriage counseling, it's a very good possibility that the divorce is still coming. But there are times where that's not the case. And I'm not saying that you coming to me equates to a divorce. What I'm saying is there are times where people will step into order and the other one will get more chaotic, and that does not jive. Opposites do not attract. Like kind attracts like kind. And if you've stepped into order and they're not in order, that's not your like kind anymore. Before you run out and get a divorce, you need to remember God hates divorce. Same Hebrew word, hate, the thorn grabbing a hold of the leg. So when we are dealing with this process of having an authority over the door, what you need to understand is there needs to be a balance between when shame is appropriate to get you back to the tent and when being in the tent will cause you to want to be outside in order to bring order to this world. Being in the tent, provision, protection, instruction. Remember, let's take instruction, for example. Instruction, what? Tells you what sin is. Paul says, if I had not seen that it's thou shalt not covet, then I would not have known what coveting was. Right? Remember, sin is telling you how close you've come, not how much you've failed. And so then it drives you out to try to bring order. You will feel a moment when repentance is legitimate, and immediately you will receive your abundance. Remember, faith brings the birthright, obedience brings the blessing, head and not the tail, abundance, right? Blessed shall be your kneading bowls, blah, 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 blah. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 through 14. You will want to share it. You will feel within you a pull, a magnetism towards the weaker vessel, a magnetism towards the lesser, a magnetism towards the least of these. And you will visit the sick. You will comfort the prisoner. You will feed the hungry. You will quench the thirsts. You will give warmth to those who are cold. In that understanding, now you can see why there needs to be a governance of the door. But how is this related to generations? How is this related to childbirthing? One could argue that the biggest point or process here is that you want to imprint upon the next generation these learnings and what? Positive emotional attachment to them. So that when that next generation is born, they will step forward and they will think to themselves, I can succeed. I am not entitled to something because my mother was hurt. And I carry that hurt because you've healed from it, because we've dealt with it. We've removed the power behind it. When we're dealing with trauma, we're dealing with abuse, obviously there's healing that needs to occur. But do you know how many people love to say, I have bipolar disorder? Or my father was an alcoholic and they're just a mess. They want to stay in it. They want to stay in it because their DNA says that it works. But it doesn't work, does it? It never works. You got to remember, When you're driving a car, you're driving a stick shift. You start out, you push in you think in your mind, okay, I got to push in the clutch. Somebody's telling you this, right? They're saying, okay, you got to push in the clutch, you got to shift the thing, you got to listen for the RPMs, you got to put the gas, and you're going, yeah, right? And you're going, it's good, right? And you are not driving, right? And then there will come a time when you got a soda in one hand, you got a cell phone in the other, you're driving with your elbow, you got your foot on the gas and the brake because, that's what's going on there. And you were grinding them to find them because why? You're able to sink or shift. You don't even have to touch the clutch. All subconsciously. Well, there's two things that are important. Number one is you've learned how to shift the car, and now your brain has imprinted that instruction, that information, that model of how to do things, right? But you need to remember there was a first time that occurred, and that's when that information was imprinted. And so when we're talking about generations, we need to go back to the first time, and we need to start to uproot the power of Hasatan upon what? Upon our authority, upon our energy, and upon our collective conscience. We need to be in one accord, but the only way we're going to do that is if we start to activate self-mastery, which is going to require humility, because we're going to have to remember that we're the problem. We're the why the world is so horrible. And until you realize that and accept that and are okay with that and begin to repent and return to the tent and start to lose all of the pagan infiltrations that have come into your beautiful religion. Remember, he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, so we might become the righteousness of God. That's the core of Christianity. All this other fluff, all of these other false doctrines, all of these pagan infiltrations do not play a role in how you are supposed to serve and walk with your God. And if you need instruction about that, go read Deuteronomy 12. Where Moses even tells the people, today you're going to change. You've been doing whatever is right in your own eyes, or you've been doing your own thing. It's going to change today. Whoa. So as we begin to look at the process here of generations, this is what I want you to think about. If the sins of the fathers are visited on the third and fourth generation of those who hate Yahweh, but what? Mercy is upon the generations of those who love him. You need to understand that the future you, the future self, the future part that is going to what? Achieve this change needs to be believable. How many people will endeavor to start a business or start to do something and they will fail miserably at it? And when they're asked why, they say they don't know, because it's imprinted upon them to fail. Who told you you were naked? We need to find out who told you you were naked. We need to find out who told you you were bad. Right? So, in summary, number one is generations is derived from the Hebrew word for birthing, to birth something. Comes from the root word that has to do with the idea of something becoming new or a new thing coming. A creative process, if you will. But all of that has to do with what? The governing of the door of the tent. Again, coming back to self-mastery, sure, but now all of a sudden we're dealing with what? Epigenetics. We're dealing with DNA information. Do we need to do our own healing because of all the mess we've been through in our lives so far? Look, I'm 47 years old. I got a plenty of mess that are my own learnings and emotional attachments to those learnings that need to be undone. But now we're talking about what decisions my grandma made that are imprinted upon my DNA. When you begin to accept that you need to change, I'm going to tell you that there is going to be a resistance from the corporate collective conscience of darkness. I'm going to apologize for the fact that sometimes that's going to be people very close to you. And what I mean by that is as you begin to step into change, the people who are comfortable in the way things are, whether they benefit from it or whether it's safe for them, will not like that change because their mind is still twisted. The rope is still twisted. They are still evil. Okay? The difference between someone who is willing to step into that and who isn't is a believer and an unbeliever. Somebody say, oh, wait a minute. No. It's about if you accept Christ and your soul is sealed in heaven and all that stuff. And that's what makes you a believer. Problem number one, I have met Christians who were saved who were doing serious damage to this world. And I have also met Christians who were saved and who are very, very, very much not believers, who are operating in unbelief, who are plagued with doubt and failure and are governed by their traumas when they were a child and are governed by a bunch of boundaries that they set with human beings because they don't want to be hurt again. But they're going to heaven. A believer versus an unbeliever is somebody who has stepped out of their limiting beliefs, stepped out of their entitlement, stepped out of their traumas or hurts, and is able to meet the present head on as a new experience. That's where the strong mind comes in. That's where we start to get into what Yeshua taught about the mind, what Paul taught about the mind, what Peter taught about the mind. So where does this all start? This starts with an understanding that just because you have accepted Christ does not mean you have even started to remotely become the change that this world needs. In fact, you are probably a problem. You are probably pushing your religion upon people because you believe that that's what you're supposed to do. You are probably judging people, which is actually accumulating more reciprocation upon you that you don't want. The journey is going to require humility. That humility will change generations. For those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom and thank you for attending. For those of you who are, that didn't go.